I'd like to talk about the issue of domestic sex trafficking through the lens of what God has led us to do about it. So if you came to get a Human Trafficking 101 presentation, you can stay later and we'll take you through that. What we'd like to do is give you the benefit of this amount of time in this space so that you understand what issues we're tackling about human trafficking here in the United States. So Patricia is on point. God, in his infinite sense of humor, decided to take somebody who was an internet consultant down in Washington, D.C., making stupid amounts of money and just having a grand old time, and rescue her from her affluence by introducing me. I know, right? I'll save you from that. And save me by having me meet a particular person named Heather. So I'm going on this street outreach with a group of Korean Presbyterians. Whatever. I know, I think of that line in the movie My Cousin Vinny, 'cause you blend, right? So here we are, a bunch of Korean Presbyterians and me, going down to downtown Baltimore in the hood. Whatever. But it was so amazing. It was an incredible experience for me because I watched these people jump out of this, van and minister to drug addicts and prostitutes and homeless people and all of that. And I had to come with the harsh realization that these were all the people that I would just drive by and pretend not to notice. And as many times that I'd gone through Baltimore City, they just became like that white noise in your life, because you're like, well, I can't do anything about that, so blah, la, 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 better not see it. Well, God decided that that blindness was going to be cured in me, and he set up this fateful encounter with this girl named Heather. And Heather and I sat on a stoop on Payson Avenue for about 3 hours. And this gal, who on a good day was 90 pounds, and she was pretty hyped up on oxycodone, and we sat there talking, and she told me about her life. And she told me that when she was 14 years old, in a little town just on the other side of the Beltway, that she lived in a modest house with her single-parent mom, and mom had a boyfriend, and he was okay, but broke up with mom and maintained contact with Heather. And he convinced Heather, at 14 years of age, to run away with him. And he proceeded to take this little girl to a motel room several states away, molest her, and then traffic her. And then he trafficked her up and down the I-95 corridor for about 4 years. By then she was addicted to drugs. And now she's of no use to him because as a commodity, she's kind of spent. And so he drops her off on the streets of Baltimore because, quite frankly, who's going to notice just another one of those people that we drive by and pretend not to see? But God decided in that moment that I would not only see her, but that he would use that encounter to sear my heart. I remember specifically, I went back home, and I've got an adolescent daughter at home at the time. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that was an interesting experience today, but now I'm going to go back to my regular life. And I'm sitting there and I'm making dinner, and I'm going to be at the, doing the dishes and all of this. And the Holy Spirit just decided, you're going down, Missy. And my knees collapsed and I fell to the floor and I'm just bawling. And it's almost as if like the pain that the Lord felt for Heather was processing through my body. I was just heaving in angst over Heather, but Heather and all the Heathers. And my daughter comes in. You know when your adolescent starts taking that parental tone with you? It's such a nice transfer. And she comes in and she's like, you're never going out there again. I don't like this. This isn't healthy. Rah, 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 rah. And in a Linda Blair kind of way, I sort of spun around on my neck. But I knew I was speaking like from the Spirit, that it was like, no, actually, it's because of this that I must. And I knew in that moment that conviction was seared upon me and life was not going to be the same. And in about 2 months, I had sold my home and sold my company and told my daughter I was probably not going to pay for college. Whoopsie. And we were off on this wild adventure. And we started one of the first restorative care programs in the United States, specifically in the Mid-Atlantic, for victims of human trafficking. Did I have any background in this? No. Internet consultant. Not a clue. But God prepares those he calls, right? He doesn't wait for you to be ready. And so now I'm on this journey where I have basically given away everything to do this thing that I don't know how I'm supposed to do. So if you think, oh my gosh, what a strong and courageous woman, ha 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 ha, no, lots of crying, lots and lots of crying, lots of sitting there and going, Lord, you've got to be kidding. But what I had going for me was I was determined to figure it out. I was determined, when you realize the gifts that God has implanted in you early on, I've had to go on that discovery to realize that one of the things that God has done in my wiring is I'm incredibly curious, and I will not leave a question alone. So if my question is, I don't know how to help them, then the answer is figure it out. That's right? Figure it out. And what that meant for us in our organization, and at the time that the Lord called us into this work, was that every woman that crossed our threshold, every girl that came into our program was going to be a teacher for us. And we needed to look at them not as, oh, that poor, pathetic victim that I have to take care of, but instead, that person who has so much to teach me about a world I don't understand, about an experience I've never had, right? So it's always this posture of how do you enter into suffering? How do you step into somebody else's pain? How do you understand it from their perspective? Today we say trauma-informed care. The wisest clinical psychologist that I know, Diane Langberg, my friend, says it's not about being trauma-informed, it's about being informed about her trauma. It's about entering in where she is and what she's experienced. And I have to say that that has served us well. We ran this restorative care program, so restorative for us is long-term care. We ran this program for about 13 years. By then we had 3 houses, and we were running a school, and we had a vocational training program. And we were having, oddly enough, a number of people come to us, even internationally, come to us and say, you're having success. How are you doing what you're doing? How can we learn from your model? What can you teach us? And you know, that was sort of pricking the teacher in me. I loved being able to do that. I loved being able to pour into other people. And so with that, but then also, quite frankly, the realization that not everybody in the world wants to come to Baltimore. What? Why not? And then, you know, the Lord sometimes sends somebody in your path. And so here comes my brother, and he steps into my life, and he says, you know, you really should focus on what you're good at. Backhanded compliment from a sibling, gotta love it, right? And I'm like, oh, do tell, Obi-Wan. And he says, you really should be about teaching people to do this as opposed to doing it, because you're not gonna help everybody. And that was such a pivotal moment. So in a very, very difficult conversation with the board, at the time Patricia was on the board, very difficult conversation saying, we've devoted the last 13 years to ministering to these women and girls one at a time. What do we feel called to do now? And it was to move into more of a discipleship role, to look at the landscape and say, gosh, we have got to do something about the fact that this is a problem across the United States, and there is a dearth of care across America. So could we perhaps multiply the territory by being in that role of equipping? And so we made this big pivot. And I have to tell you, it was painful, because after 13 years of every single day doing life with this population that I have come to love deeply, every one of them is a Heather in my heart, that to leave that and say, okay, we're going to go do this new thing. And what we're doing now as the Institute for Survivor Care is we are trying to advance both policy and practice. And so we want the structure of what we do and the practice of what's being done to meet the needs of survivors of sexual exploitation here in the United States. And I'm going to elaborate more on what that looks like. But in broad strokes, we work on training, we work on research, we develop tools, and we foster collaborations specifically with agencies that are upholding a biblical worldview. And so that is the heartbeat of who we are, but I want you to understand kind of what mobilizes us on a daily basis, because it's very easy to be in direct care. What's the problem is right in front of you every single day. And so you say, it's got flesh on it, I understand now what I'm supposed to do. But when you move into more of this equipping and educating role, for those of you that are in that capacity, I think people like Mark, we just met, when you're in that capacity, you're one step removed away from the problem. And so you have to stay really grounded in what drives you. And what drives us is that we know that there really isn't full healing outside of Christ. And so we have got to make sure that there is always the provision here in the United States that people will have bodily healing, they will have circumstantial healing, but they will have soul healing as well. And so that's a huge driver for us. We were asked yesterday, what's a differentiator from us and perhaps any other organization? And we are unapologetically Christian all day. We say internally, it's Jesus or nothing. We believe that God desires that all should come to him. And so we want to make sure that the landscape of care in the Christian sector of this has a wide open mat, that we are not creating such safe spaces that we actually exclude the people who are in the most need. And sometimes in a field like human trafficking, where they can scare the bejeebus out of you by saying, oh my gosh, bad people in the bushes going to come get you, da-da-da-da-da, and they can just scare you, it can actually be a repellent for us to engage in the issue. And so what we've got to do is we've got to have the courage to say, no, I know God wants her, so I've got to enter into that battlefield. I have, as it says for David, he ran to the battlefield. And that's the stance that we have to have. And so we are also committed to showing the world that Christian work can and frankly must be excellent. And I want to underscore that with a little story. About 2010, we were doing an event at the Museum of the Bible in DC, and we'd gathered government leaders and NGOs together to talk about the issue of sex trafficking in America. And we were looking to foster these kinds of collaborations. And in a pivotal moment for me in particular, the TIP ambassador, Trafficking in Persons ambassador out of the State Department, John Cotton Richmond, he stood up and he said, you know, the government would work with the church more if the church wasn't so sloppy.
The government's got room to talk.
That may be, but he's not wrong. He's not wrong. Because what I was seeing in our landscape in particular was we had a lot of people who ran in with feeling and no technique and no posture of learning and no humility. I'm just going to come in and love up on you. And we did a lot of damage. We did a lot of damage in the early years. Because if you take somebody who, quite frankly, in that moment of desperation is like holding broken glass, and you think you're going to squeeze them tight, guess who gets hurt? Both of you. So we did a lot of damage. So we were committed from that moment. I consider that a word from God. It was like, we will not be sloppy. And we will embrace what Scripture says, which is you should do such good works that they will glorify your Father in heaven. And so that is a huge driver for us, is we want to make sure that the work that's being done by Christian providers across the United States is excellent. So I'm going to use, as the way I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to try to tell you more about what's happening about human trafficking in America, but weaving that in with, and what are you doing about it? And they are often prompted by those questions. Remember I said that one of the things God's wired me for is a curiosity, right? What's the question? Pursue the answer. So we have been beating our chest for the last 15 years in America about this idea that there's not enough care, there's no services, there's no beds. Some of you have heard that, right? Oh my gosh, it's a crisis, there's no beds, right? It's not true, y'all. I want you to be able to walk out of here and I want you to understand that's not true. The actual problem is a different problem. And we have to be able to be not so simplistic that we're willing to understand the nuance of what the real problem is. We have currently in the United States 220 shelters that specialize in victims of trafficking. 64% of them are Christian organizations. Okay, so about 144 of those agencies. What number of beds those equate to? An average agency has about 9 beds. So if you had this idea that we're building these big hospitals, anybody from Texas? Yeah, y'all have to stop. You have to stop with the everything has to be enormous. goodness, we're going to build a 300-bed capacity. I'm like, have you met a survivor? It's like a person with an exponent of 4, right? So we have, on average, these facilities are largely pretty small. They're about 9 beds on average. So they're usually in suburban homes, in suburban neighborhoods, right? So this is not the, oh my gosh, Liam Neeson in the bushes. We've got to have this secure campus. We got to have all of that. Like, you've got to help people clean that up. Right? We did a study specifically on security issues, and we found over an 8-year period of the agencies, there were 2 incidences when anybody of a nefarious nature was trying to get on a campus. It doesn't happen because the reality is, unfortunately, the truth is the pimp's not going to go back and get her because I can go online and go get 10 more. And frankly, Heather's already spent. She's of no use to me. Unfortunately, this field wants fresh meat. And there are so many vulnerable women and children and boys who are available for the pickings. And so the idea that the supply is limited is unfortunately a fallacy. What hasn't been abated, frankly, is the demand. And that's the bigger problem. So it's not that there are no beds. We see on average, because we study this space, one of our areas of expertise is we know who's out there, we know what they do, we know what their services are, we know who they serve, we visit most of them. And so we can tell you, if you want to know what's going on in Iowa, I will set you up, right? So that's a big part of our business, but we also want to know who are they serving. So when they say there are no beds, guess what? We can tell you there are no beds for boys. Not true. Not true. Because if you look right there, the ones that are serving women with children, there are 75. The ones that are serving men and boys, there are 45. Did you know there are 8 facilities in the United States that serve men with children? We don't even think about that, right? So it's not that there are no beds. The bigger problem is we do not have a good pipeline from the victim to the services. We have not built that channel out. And please don't say, "Nuh-uh, I was in the Atlanta airport and there's a poster on the back of the bathroom." Honey, that's not helping. That's not helping, because we're doing a study right now of survivors, and you know what they're telling us? You put up an 800 number, and what do I see as a victim? Cop. I'm not calling that number. I know somebody in the government is behind that issue, right? So that doesn't look like help to me. We've got to have a different strategy. So the real problem is, yeah, we have a lot of victims that need to get to services, but we haven't built a good invitation to those services. And I think that's part of the call to the church to engage. Here's another issue. We tend to want to compartmentalize what the problem looks like. It is so sympathetic for us to say, oh my gosh, those horrible, gangsters that are going after the children. Because if we can say that's the problem, if we can identify it that way, then we can distance ourselves from the reality of the problem. Because the reality of the problem in America is that an exploiter can be just about anybody. It can be a school teacher. It can be a doctor. It can be a pastor, right? An exploiter can be just about anybody. We did a study in 2021, largely provoked from the work that we did in residential care, because time and time again, we were hearing just really strange conversations that were happening in the dynamic between the daughter and her family. And we'd be like, that's just odd, immoral, bizarre conversation. We said, what is behind this issue? There's a phenomenon here we don't understand. So we embarked on a national study to take a look at the issue of familial trafficking. Now, oddly enough, I grew up in Bangkok. And so the idea that a parent might sell their child was not terribly foreign to me as a concept. But here I am now in Baltimore, in America, in my country. And you know what we found out? 3,500 cases of child trafficking in the United States, across the United States, and between a quarter to a half of them were at the hands of a family member. So we've got to think very differently about the other that we're also afraid of, because the other exists, but we've also got a problem in the home. And the church, above all, should be speaking into the family, should be speaking into the role of fathers. We found, as other studies have, that 60 to 64% of the time, the exploiter is the biological mother of that child. And that jacks with everything we want to believe about motherhood. But we also have a crisis in this country where we have, in some populations, 70% of those kids are growing up in fatherless homes. And those women may, if they have a drug problem, under duress say, I will do whatever I have to do to get my heroin, and if that means turn my child over to somebody, that's what happens. Because in our study, the exchange of that child for sex in exchange for drugs was the #1 form of commerce. So we've got some really hard issues to tackle, and that's where the church has to run to the battlefield. That's where we have to run in and say, I'm not going to run from the problem just because I recoil at the reality of it. I'm going to run towards it, because you know what? We actually have the answer. The answer is God's design for family, right? The answer is redemption. The answer is there, but we've got to leverage it in some of these really difficult places. We heard a wave of condemnation because the Christian sector is the larger portion of the landscape, and the condemnation that frankly is just convenient. And you've all heard it, right? You're shoving Jesus down, right? You've heard it, okay? So the idea that faith-based organizations are forcing religion, you are no better than their captors because you've got them in a shelter and they're in a confined space and you are just, right, giving them the gospel oppressively. So we said, you know what? We're going to sit with that question, but we're going to sit with that question courageously. What if they're right? Because if they're right, then we have a responsibility as a field to correct our behavior. Not only is it against federal law, but it's not a pathway to Christ. So we did another study. There's going to be a theme here. We did another study. This was just last year. And this particular study, we asked survivors who had either been in a faith-based program or who currently in a faith-based program, what were your experiences? We wanted to know, what was your history with faith? What kind of world did you grow up in? If you follow like the Barna reports, for example, you see religiosity is really on the decline. A biblical worldview is on the decline here in America. So we wanted to see, well, gosh, if you weren't even raised with faith, then yeah, some of these practices may seem really pretty odd to you. But here's the point. We wanted to understand, how were survivors perceiving that? What was their take on that? Because we know with sincerity we want them to have a relationship with Christ, but maybe some of our methods are getting in the way. Well, here's the incredible good news that we have to share with you. We did this study and we found out that 75% of survivors intentionally chose to go to a faith-based program. 47% of the time because they wanted to reclaim the faith of their childhood, 26% of the time because they wanted to become a person of faith. They said that the #1 spiritual practice that contributed to their healing, Bible study. Rock your world, right? We found out that 91% of these survivors said that they never felt pressured to engage in a faith practice. So yes, we are meeting the letter of the law by and large. Now, I always add in, okay, well, what about the 9%? In my mind, this is my little sidebar caveat, having served adolescents and grown women, sometimes an adolescent will just tell you they just don't want to do something. And it has nothing to do with that being compelled. If any of you have been, Missy, you're getting in the car. We're going, right? You understand. There could be 9% of that going on, but it's great that actually we found out that no, we can refute that accusation with data now to be able to say, no, this sector is not violating the law, and in fact, we are offering a service that 75% of these survivors said they actually want that particular service. We also learned that as a result of being in these programs, 84% of them now identify as Christians themselves, which is such good news. One of the things that's been difficult, particularly in entering in so early into this field back in the 2000s, was there was no preparation for this. Remember, I told you in my opening that I'm sitting there and I'm like, Lord, what we doing here? I don't know what I'm doing. I only raised one kid. I've not done 14, and not ones that are shard glass either. And so there was no preparation for this work at the time. There's no degree. There still isn't. You can get an undergraduate degree in human trafficking, but it's not the same as doing this work. So we said, well, we're going to have to build it. So we built a curriculum for direct care staff, for people who need to understand the victimology of sex trafficking, for people who need to deeply understand what it means to operate out of a trauma-informed care position. We built around how do we make sure that scripture is woven throughout what we do? How do we introduce spirituality in a way that is safe and is also trauma-informed? How do we make sure that these agencies stabilize? Because between the years of 2007 and 2014, we saw so many of these ministries start with all that budding enthusiasm, all that run in, I'm going to love up on, and they lasted about 2 years. And that's a problem. It's a problem because by starting a shelter, you make a promise to the victim community. And you have to be able to fulfill that promise over the long haul. This is not a quick fix ministry at all. For any of you who work with people of abuse or addictions, you know it's a long road. And so what we realized was that from a ministry perspective, they were not prepared. They didn't have the business side of running a ministry. So to Patricia's point, if any of you are really good in business, my goodness, you could work with shelters to help them shore up the foundation of operating as a good ministry in addition to operating care. I remember I had a survivor, she painted this picture for me so well. She says, I appreciate that it's your heart that got you into this work, but when it hits the fan, there better be something in your head. Mic drop. So we have trained about 40 shelters so far in our intensive program. Last year alone, we helped to launch 6 new shelters, which equates to about 50 new beds. So a big part of what we are trying to do is 64% of the landscape is great, but 75 would be better. And so we are trying to encourage new ministries like the one that's going to open in Iowa. We're going to try to help them with that. In doing this work, we have seen, as is true in ministry, that the turnover can be really high, particularly if you come in with all this bounding enthusiasm and then you realize, I'm here, with the kind of enthusiasm that this person has, right? And she comes in and she's like perky in the morning, and all you get day after day is whatever. Because remarkably, survivors are not grateful to be rescued. They're not happy about it, right? Because that's just our idea. Our idea is that's all bad stuff, and we're the good people taking you away from the bad stuff. But what we fail to understand is 94% of these survivors across the country were molested as children. Bad stuff goes all the way back to childhood. You coming along when I'm 32 years old and going to rescue me does very little to heal the deep soul wounds that started when I was 6. That's a very different posture that we have to take. We have to understand that that brokenness that we talk about is fragile and oftentimes unspoken. I've learned over the last 20 years that what we actually are doing when we're ministering to these, primarily females is what we serve, but when we're ministering to these individuals, we are not attending to the issues of trafficking. Because by the time she went from 6, where her uncle was molesting her, and she ran away at 15, on average, that's when it happens, right? And she's out there surviving in and out of relationships that are meant to protect her, which is a form of survival, finding somebody who can take care of you, even if that comes at a cost, right? By the time she's gotten that far, we're not attending to the issues of trafficking, because it isn't things like how many men bought you, how many times a day were you raped. Never ask those questions, because that doesn't hurt her nearly as much as the fundamental relational betrayal that started way back here. Because now, you know what? Unfortunately, it's just business. It's just business. It's how I live. And my normal isn't your normal. And so we're actually ministering to the deep soul wounds that happened a long, long time ago, because we have to have the courage to run towards that battlefield that has to heal in order for that person to have a new life and a fresh perspective. So we have realized that there is a lot of training that has to go into doing this work. You cannot just jump into this recklessly. So we've invested a tremendous amount of time building up the capacity to train workers for the field, right? The field is ripe for harvest. The workers are few and they're not prepared. And so we want to make sure that there is adequate preparation. So we created, in addition to our in-person learning, we have online learning, and we have over 100 different titles. And all of those titles come from a biblical worldview. So we're going to talk about trauma-informed care, but we're going to make sure that you understand how that gets executed in a way that honors the faith. We have about half of the shelter landscape that's using that tool currently to train their staff and their volunteers. And I'll give you a little prelude to something we're working on right now, because it's so cool. We have been challenged because we built over 100 courses for the direct care provider, for the one who's ministering, who's doing the work. But then we got challenged to say, well, could you develop content directly for the survivors? You've got Shelter U. What if we had Survivor U? That sounds delicious. Let's play with that. And so what we're doing right now, we'll be filming it starting June 9th, is we are flying in survivors who have had years of recovery, and we are going to do a series called Women of the Bible Like Me. And each one of those women has picked a character in Scripture that resonates with her story. She's going to tell the story from Scripture, and then she's going to give her testimony on how that connects, so that we can put that package together and we can make it available to all the shelters, so that they can have the benefit of survivors across the country who've walked the journey that they may have walked, but who can also say, this isn't 2,000 years ago. This still connects with me today. And because it connects with me, maybe it also connects with you. So we're pretty excited about that project and hope to be doing more projects like that. All right. So then we were challenged, well, wait a second, can I get in on that training? Maybe some of you come from church, you work in other ministries, maybe you're a pregnancy crisis, maybe you work with homelessness, addictions, etc. And they said, well, how can we get in on that shelter training? And we said, well, we'll just build another platform for you. So we created something called Equip You, which is for the church as well as for those who are ministering, working with this population, but in a non-residential setting. Because there's something that's really different. Those of you who have kids, you know. Like when people tell you about your child and you're like, you don't live with them, right? It's real different when you live with them. So we have one platform for those that are doing residential, and this other learning platform that is for those who are allied professionals who are working with populations analogous or directly with the trafficked population. So this is the geeky part, because what we heard from the landscape itself was, we're doing all this work, we're in our trench, we're doing the thing, but remember I said they're generally not really good at business. And one of the challenges we heard from the shelter community is, we don't know how to tell the rest of you that we're actually doing good work. And those of you that want to donate, you're like, which one do I donate to? Because I don't know who's doing good work. Right? And how do we know what good work means? Well, all of those are really important questions. And if we're going to mature this field, we have to have a way of telling. As one philanthropist told me, it was absolutely brilliant. He goes, I have 1,000 nonprofits at my door who can tell a story. Everybody's got a story. But you have my attention if you can tell story and spreadsheet. Tell me story and spreadsheet. Back up what you say. Don't just make me cry. Compel me with your numbers. And we said, gosh, wisdom in that little statement. And so what we did was we said, all right, let's create a case management tool that can be deployed across the United States so that these agencies know, what should I gather? What's important? How do I report? How do I know that that woman is making progress? In what different areas of their recovery that are actually important to us. And so we right now have about 24% of the shelters using this particular tool. This year we will produce the first national report on the data that we've derived. We currently have 3,900 records, survivor records in this database, and that will be the largest collection of survivor data in the United States. So we're very excited about being able to mine that data and see what it tells us so that we can not only inform policy, but we can also inform practice. So we can say, you might like doing the equine therapy, but it's not producing the results. I'm not picking on the horse people. Don't get crazy. I know. Horse people are a little crazy. But I'm in Kentucky now. I'm in Kentucky now. So I mentioned to you that sometimes it's like we don't know what the outcomes are, so we don't know how to support. Whether you're coming from a church perspective or you're an individual donor, and we were talking about this just earlier, we were getting the inquiries from philanthropists who wanted to invest seriously in this space, right? So it's a Christian person who's done well in business, and they're like, we really want to pour into this space. We get it. We care about this issue. But frankly, it's kind of the Wild West out there. So how do we know where to put the money? And as I established, we had a season there where they were cropping up left and right and crashing and burning. And so there's a skepticism. Well, we don't want to dissuade people from giving their material gifts to this work. And so what we did was we created a legacy fund, and that legacy fund allows givers to give to us to give to them. So for example, we have a donor out of Reno who is extraordinarily generous, and what we do is we then scholarship with the money they've given us, we scholarship the agencies. So I'll keep using Iowa as an example. So this organization wants to start a shelter, but they don't have the means to go to the training, they don't have the means to buy the tools, that kind of thing. How can we use this funder's resources to equip that agency? And then sometimes there are donors who are like, well, I'm in Michigan. We'll use Michigan now. I'm in Michigan. I want to be able to support shelters in Michigan. Well, we've got our map. We can tell you who's out there. We can tell you what work they're doing. And we can help direct the funds, whether it comes through us or not, to those agencies that are doing the work in your area. So that's an area that we didn't anticipate we would be working on, but we have found it to be incredibly fruitful, as I just was talking about with the sisters here, the triad of sisters that we have. There's two missing, but what we were talking about was we now have a funder who is really invested in the Christian anti-trafficking work internationally. And so they came to us and they said, given the fact that you study this space, can you help us give better to those agencies? Vet them for us so that we can give to the ones that are promising in their practices. So I think that's also something else that we just have to think differently as the church, because we tend to be a little miserly about, like, oh my gosh, we're all kind of scraping for the same dollar, when instead, as we see in Acts, we might do a whole lot better if we pooled and then gave out with wisdom, right? Had a team of people, whether it's us or whether it's, whomever, but to know where will we sow into this work that has the most promise of bearing fruit. And as I know viscerally, this work is fantastically lonely. If you are the only shelter in Utah, or you are the only shelter in Baltimore, you are sitting in a very, very deep hole all by yourself with the occasionally just, hello, right? Is anybody there? And it's so hard, because it's also work where it's not really fun to talk about. You become that pariah that nobody wants at the cocktail party, right? You become the person in the airplane where they go, and what do you do? Sex trafficking? Oh. They either think you're a cop or they don't want to talk to you, right? And so it creates this vibe that isolates you. And so we said, well, we've got to make sure that the workers in the field are prepped for the long haul. And the way we have to do that is through community. And so just this year, in April of this year, we launched the first Christian conference on sexual exploitation. It's a wide tent. Anybody that's involved in serving this population from a biblical worldview is welcome. People who want to enter into the field are welcome. People who are seasoned in the field are welcome. But what we're trying to do is we are trying to build up this body of Christ to be equipped to do this work well, and also foster those connections that are so vital to expanding our reach. And that might be, I don't even know who else is in my state doing this work. And it's remarkable how often that happens. Right? Not just in Texas, but all over the place, because you're so head down doing the thing that you're not spending the time, you don't have the time to figure out, gosh, there's an addictions facility that's actually been seeing a lot of trafficked people lately, and maybe we could partner with them because 87% of survivors present with some form of addiction. And so we actually have to be much more knitted in with the addiction community, which is why our organization has formed a partnership with the Gospel Rescue Missions through Citygate. Because we have to see, remember I said about the pipeline, they're seeing this population on the front end, but if they're not hearing that there are services available to them, we're not creating them an opportunity to say, maybe today will be the day that I'll make a change. Maybe today will be the day that I will put this down and I will believe that there's something else for me. So I invite you to learn more about that. Coming to a close here, we talk an awful lot about how do we engage survivors. So we're launching a new program this August called the Certified Peer Support for Exploitation. Actually was born out of an idea from a survivor who came to me and she said, she's one of our teachers, and she said, I have this crazy idea, you're probably not gonna like it, whatever. And I'm thinking about my brother and I'm like, hey, when somebody comes to you with a word, just sit there and listen. And she says, I really have this idea. I'm an addiction specialist. I went through all the training. I love doing that role. Why don't we have the same preparation for survivors? Why aren't we giving them a pathway, an on-ramp to engage in this work? We do it with addictions, and it works really well. So why aren't we doing this for exploitation? I'm like, brilliant. Let's run with that. So in August, we will be launching with the first cohort of 10 survivors from across the country who will be coming in, and we will be doing about 60 hours of training and coaching and mentorship, because what we want to do is we want to be able to equip them to leverage their experiences, but also to be able to extrapolate their experiences onto yours were different. Yours was different, and that's okay, but how can we work on this together so that they can then become embedded in residential programs to lend that voice. And you know, I walked away from this and I thought, this reminds me of an experience I had back in Baltimore when I was doing residential care. It was so amazing. I had read John 4 like a million times because we were called the Samaritan women. Like, got it. Understand that. And you know how the Holy Spirit will all of a sudden bring to light a line, a word, a passage that you've read a million times, and then all of a sudden it's new again? Well, that is exactly what happened for me. So several years in, I'm reading John 4 again, probably with some little passivity, and then all of a sudden, John 4:39 jumps off the page and convicts me. Because of her testimony, many believed. And I was like, you know what? This is what we're supposed to be about. We are supposed to be about preparing her to go back into her Samaria. Whether that's go back into her family, go back into a community, go back into normal, right? Whatever that looks like, right? To be able to equip her to walk confidently back into whatever her Samaria is, whatever the Lord has prepared, and to become a witness for His glory. And so we're super excited about where this is going to lead us for that. So I will conclude with this. I said in the very beginning that it's so funny when people say, I didn't even know you existed, right? Well, now you do. Now you know that there's an organization out there that is doing this specifically for organizations that want to adhere to a biblical worldview, that want to serve this population with excellence, that are committed by heart, but are also willing to use their head. But now that, as women would always tell you, once you know better, you do better, right? And so that's my conviction to you, is now that you know better, what will you do?